an absolute tragedy in terms of the inequality that's already at play that will be widened by what's happening. We're talking by the middle of this century, low estimation is 140 million climate migrants moving around. Higher estimations are over 1 billion.
Flipping the table.
Today, I dialogue once again with Dr. Britt Wray. She's not a maker or a farmer, but is a writer and correspondent focused on science. She is the author of Rise of the Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction, about which we spoke in February, a few weeks before the pandemic that has changed our lives. In that episode, we spoke of the erosion of science as an arbiter of societal dilemmas faced by nations or the planet when dealing with huge challenges. COVID-19 has once again revealed how powerful forces can attempt to deny or manipulate science for political or economic purposes. We also spoke of a book she was then writing and has recently completed the first draft of. Currently titled Generation Dread, the book is about the emotional repercussions of waking to the climate and biodiversity emergency and how to harness that for a sense of personal agency rather than psychological catastrophe, namely fatalism and doomerism. I think that both COVID and racially motivated murder fit the category of emergency, with implications for our mental health. So I thought it was a good moment to dialogue again with Dr. Wray about her new book and the events of this moment. In addition to being an author, Dr. Wray has extensive experience as a broadcast correspondent and host in both the UK and Canada for award-winning podcasts and programs like Tomorrow's World and The Nature of Things. She has a PhD in science communication from the University of Copenhagen. Britt, welcome back to Flipping the Table.
Hey, Michael, thanks so much. Good to be back.
So, crazy time since we last met. How are you feeling?
Yeah. So much has happened since we last met. COVID has happened. An uprising in the face of racial injustice has happened. And the climate crisis keeps ticking in the background. And today I am feeling intense. I got to be honest with you. And, many days I'm very much mentally aware of everything that's going on and able to float through it. But today is just one of those days when the emotions really drop down hard. And I think generally in society, there's been a large widening of people's capacity to really get in touch with their grief and their anxiety. And that's where I am at today. And I think it's a good thing that people get in touch with that. There's a lot of pain in the world right now.
I'm totally with you. It's amazing because the last podcast I did, which we just dropped last Thursday, was with a friend and colleague of mine who works on healing the divides of race and privilege. And we talked about the need to feel and the need to understand what's going on in your body. And that is a pathway to healing many of the things, the ills of our world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a way for people from different worlds to connect because we all have feeling and sensation.
Yeah, so, it's a way to connect with your humanity and that in everyone else.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know also you have been working very hard on a book. You were writing it when we met last February, but so you finished that. So maybe that's part of it too, letting down that energy. So tell us about the book.
Maybe. Yeah. Thank you. I've been writing the first draft. It's not done, but the manuscript of the first draft is completed. The book is called Generation Dread. And it is about the emotional repercussions of waking up to the climate and biodiversity crisis and all the ways that it's actually interconnected with other forms of injustices. And it really started from my inquiry into this thing I was noticing where a lot of people my age and younger were saying that they are too afraid to have children because of the climate crisis and the prognosis for our future. And that was something I was personally reckoning with as well, wondering if it's, kind of a perverse thought to have connecting reproduction to the climate crisis. Is that a really out of touch, kind of white, liberal, middle-class, hand-wringing preoccupation, or is this widely felt by many people? And then realizing that this is just one symptom of a much larger cascade of psychological impacts and forms of anxiety and grief that are hitting people, and that folks are digesting in different ways that mean something to them. So for people on the fence of, wanting to have a child because they're at that place in their life, that's one way it shows up. Of course, for older people, it might be something completely different. And so I was really taken with the idea that we have not, for all the speaking and all the writing and all the organizing and deal attempts and politicizing of climate change that we've been doing for the last 30 years, we have hardly scratched the surface of the psychological impacts and talked about what that means in very human, emotional, existential terms. And I wanted to unveil for myself what's contained within that space. So the book really is taking a wide look at what the mental health impacts are, from direct acute trauma that happens when you're in a hurricane, a wildfire, heat waves, all the way to the vicarious trauma that sets in when you are really past your denial and you've woken up to the implications of what the science is saying, and match that with the gross inaction that is coming from our political establishment. So that's it in a nutshell, I would say.
Wow, that's huge. I can certainly relate, having lived through 2 fires and actually experienced rapid heartbeat, anxiety, not able to sleep
Right.
For days or weeks, living with fear and elevated, things coursing through my body. It's got to be, and there are so many things happening now that would be doing that. So, one could get depressed thinking about the implications. And so what is in the book, do you offer a path forward or a way for people to hold this reality?
Yes, that's actually the main thrust of the book. So first is giving permission to the feelings and acknowledging that it's actually a very reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, which is our reality of an unprecedented threat multiplier. And, I actually frame it more than just the climate crisis. It's the planetary health crisis. So the human enterprise has now outstripped the planet's capacity to sustain our life. It's showing up in all sorts of health detriments, but it's our erosion of soil and fresh water availability and clean air and the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. All these things together are very directly impacting human health in a medical, bodily way, as well as in a psychological way. The pandemic, for example, is a result of humans pushing too far on planetary limits and going into habitat zones of other species.
Right.
And then, the viruses jump out of them into us. So all of this is, it needs to be kind of diagnosed and understood as to what's at play here. But the main point of why I needed to write the book was to psychologically help myself and others who I know are falling into the grips of eco-anxiety, because if it's not addressed, it's a fast-track lane to psychological catastrophe, in the sense that helplessness, resignation towards the idea that the future is doomed can set in, a form of fatalism, a kind of nihilism, the belief that it's simply too late. And all of these things lead to inaction. When that is a false narrative to put your stock behind. Of course, there are inevitable losses and damages that will continue to occur, but how bad those losses get depends completely on what we do now and how we collectivize and how we turn the ship around. And so we need to find ways to step into agency, and that is rooted in our emotional intelligence and our psychological resiliency. If we don't have that, then we shut the door, we put our hands up, and we skip over the whole part where we're supposed to work really hard to make this better. And we just say it's too late, which is happening. There's a lot of popular narratives out there that are welcoming collapse, teaching us to get ready for collapse, things like that. And, there are some adaptive measures to thinking about how we get ready for some collapses, because that will be part of our future, most likely. It isn't game over, and everything depends on how we get strong and mobilize now. So really, yeah, it's about tactics, trauma-informed tactics. Clinical therapists and their tactics who specialize in eco-anxiety are riddled throughout the book to really teach people how to connect with community that can mirror their concerns, make them feel less isolated and alone, give permission to their feelings, understand that there's nothing pathological about them, nothing wrong with them. And when they're supported in those kinds of environments that normalize what's happening, these emotions can actually be harnessed and tapped into as a resource to fuel the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I was going to say that the energy that comes from fear and trauma is a survival response, is it not?
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's exactly anxiety, fear, different kinds of stress triggers show us that there's something out there that we need to mobilize resources in the face of, that we need to change our situation. It identifies what's at stake. And, a lot of anxiety disorders are where people are kind of catastrophizing about things that are not very realistic. And so psychotherapists can help try to eliminate that source of anxiety through a variety of interventions and talk therapy with them. That is based in a kind of ground logic, like fear of flying. There's statistics that can show you how irrational fear of flying really is if you're okay driving, because that's a lot more dangerous. Right. But when it comes to the anxiety that is, sprouting out because of people's awareness of climate data, you cannot remove the source of that anxiety, but you can help transform it into some kind of, the old saying from Joan Baez, action is the antidote to despair. There are real therapeutic effects of taking action and trying to close that gap, the cognitive dissonance gap that we have between seeing our lifestyles and how unsustainable they are and how far away they are from our values and our beliefs about what we should be doing. Action helps you close that gap and feel a bit more in line with yourself, as well as get the community support that you need for these emotions. So that's just one example. But
yeah. So it makes me think about the past. It makes me think about history. Humans have faced huge existential crises in the past, whether war, pestilence, famine. Did the course of your research take you into any of those past events or moments in history, American history or otherwise? Yeah. I mean, I think of the Civil War in the United States as a moment of existential crisis for, millions of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
The pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu.
Yes, I did speak to people who have lived through other forms of existential disaster in order to put this disaster ongoingly in some kind of context. Specifically, I focused a lot on the Cold War and nuclear crisis because there were people who believed that they were going to be burnt to a crisp. Cuban Missile Crisis within the night, within the evening. My father threw an end of the world party because he thought that he and his wife and his 1-year-old son were going to die. Yeah. And what that does to you psychologically, because you don't have the resources to actually escape. So you can't fight and flight are not an option. You can't get out of the space. You can't fight the idea that a world leader is going to push a big red button. So all you can do is freeze. You go numb. It's psychic numbing, the way that animals play dead in the face of a threat.
That happened in Hawaii. Remember 2 summers ago when there was the false people freaked out. We're going to die.
Yes. I mean, you can't escape. And so you do go into this numbness mode that the psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton wrote a lot about in his investigations of basically how humans can commit so much evil and the responses to that evil, whether that's bombing in Hiroshima or Chinese thought control camps or
Holocaust.
People who upheld Nazi Germany. Exactly. So a lot of my kind of insights from past modes of terror come from him. But also I spoke a lot with Indigenous people who say, this is not an apocalypse for me because my apocalypse already happened. It happened when colonizers came. And then it happened again when they didn't let me speak my language. And it happened again. I'm Canadian. So in the Canadian context, when they stole my ancestors and put them in residential schools and took our traditions and customs away from us, and on and on and on, scooped our children in the 1960s, and so it's a story of ongoing cascades of apocalypse. And this is another on top that is certainly super frightening for them, but it's just another form of colonization and the kind of terrorization it's done, because it brought the industrial practices that actually created the runaway climate change, right? Or speaking to, Black Americans in the South, I'm thinking of particularly a woman named Mary Anais Heglar, who writes about how the climate crisis is not the first existential threat. And you lose her as soon as you frame it that way, because her parents had to, and her grandparents and beyond had to survive a form of apartheid,
The slavery
and
part of that.
yes. And exactly, that historical context is really important.
Well, I'm looking for a through line here, and what I mean by that is causation. And all the things that you mentioned, I think of European colonization, but what I really think of is white patriarchy, to be honest. That's what I think about. Because to me, the word apocalypse really refers to this idea of unveiling.
Right.
And you used that term earlier. I was quite interested that you used the term. You said you were unveiling something in your writing, was unveiling something for you. And, apocalypse is about unveiling the disconnection from reality that has caused challenges. The way I look at it is that the climate crisis, the racial killing and crisis, COVID, or all this disconnection from right relationship to the ecosystem, including our fellow human beings. That's the racial problem. We're out of reality around the interconnectedness, the interdependence that actually exists. So I'm wondering if you think about that at all or discuss that at all in the book. I mean, because to end this, we have to overcome the illusion that underlies.
Yeah. Oh, that 100% is the requirement. And that is what we are all struggling to get right on. And it's why these crises that keep happening look the same in so many of their structural formats, whether we're talking about anti-Black racism or COVID-19 and how it's targeting, again, Black populations the most in terms of death toll and harm. But also why it even began in the first place, domination of nature, not respecting connection. So yes, in the book I do talk about that. I trace it, and this is really hard. How did we become so disconnected, right? It's not like white people are inherently disconnected. Something happened, we're humans. We live in the world, we're animals. We have had historical times, different cultural variations of what has now kind of grown through colonization to shape culture here. But in Celtic myth, there are other values that were inscribed in those stories about connection. There's a woman named Sharon Blackie, who is a psychologist and a myth expert, I guess I'll just call her, mythologist. And she is on a mission to show white people that their ancestors actually were connected at some point through the old stories and lore from various cultures. They were indigenous, exactly. And that the quest is to re-indigenize oneself, connect to place, connect to the inherent value and beauty of not only other humans, but other non-human species, to be, enraptured by the remarkable nature of a crow when you encounter one, and not just walk by and write it off as though it's not anything of interest.
I watch them in my backyard.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Exactly. And, she kind of draws this interesting history of how this particular group of white people who came out and colonized from the British Isles might have lost their connection based on certain things that were happening historically. And it starts with, Plato and kind of philosophers of the ancient Greek era making clear demarcations between humans and animals based on the ability to reason. And when you put value in who can rationalize, you created a separate category. You actually push one apart from others. In the scientific revolution, in that kind of era, Rene Descartes was who said, I think, therefore I am, kind of re-emphasizing this idea that rationality is the thing that brings value. Francis Bacon, who was really at the kind of thrust point of the scientific revolution, went further in saying that we need to measure and empirically understand things with our scientific instruments in order for them to have value and be real, which means that anything that can't be explained through science, anything that is kind of ephemeral or based in a sense of connection or spirituality, loses sway. And so this is where Sharon Blackie says that we became kind of de-enchanted with the world around us because everything needed to be spelled out didactically and explained through science. And you can be a very pro-science person, but still understand that there are things that humans are not, so special to be able to fully grasp and know through our instruments that we build. It's very human-centric. And
well, it's a loss of humility.
Yes, exactly.
We lose perspective on the, I will call, miracle of existence. The fact that we're even here as a universe. I mean, why?
Right.
It leaves you with a big question, right? How? Why? But I want to get to something that you're saying, that she's arguing that it began with the Greek philosophers and move away from instinct or the sense of the mystical and into the rational. I think it goes all the way back to agriculture, 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, people say that as well. That as soon as we started
nature, and they're the myths. The Bible's full of it. The leaving the garden. I mean, when we decided to leave the garden, or when we discovered we could leave the garden and not live like animals, but become like God, concept of God in terms of fostering things.
Sure.
That is also a break. I'm sure that the rationalism and the philosophers grew out of that, because then once you had agriculture, you could have the people have the time to think.
Exactly. Yes. And many people who have kind of tried to explore this through history do start it there. And it makes sense. The very act of agriculture is that you are harnessing nature for your own interests and pursuits and bending it into the shapes that you like and taking from it nonstop. So even if it's done in a sustainable way.
The anthropologists say that physically we were healthier as a species, physically healthier, when we were, hunters and gatherers. We were larger. We had larger bone mass. I always thought that there was disease, but our bodies, the basic structures of our bodies were healthier then. I've always found that fascinating. We had more disease and we shrank when we started agriculture.
Really? Interesting. Yeah.
So anyway, so where does this leave you with your thoughts about the future?
Well, it has led me to investigate how the current biomedical model that provides mental health care that we rely on is not at all in a position. It is actually scandalously underprepared to be able to scale to meet the demands that the climate crisis and the planetary health emergency more generally is going to be putting on mental health and well-being. As climate disasters ramp up, as people's awareness and their grows and their denial wears thin, the existential fear factor that is mounting needs serious attention and resilience building and kind of psychological tools for people to reorient their narratives of what the world is like. But then in a much more kind of mental injury sort of vein, we need real mental health care in places where people are going to be slipping into post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidality, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, child abuse, all these things that spike when we see climate disasters. And so I've been working to understand as much about the psychiatric epidemiology that I can, and what it says about how we can get out of this mental model where we just think of hospitals, psychiatrists, therapists to be able to help people with mental health issues, when we simply don't have enough of those to scale to meet the problem as it's going to increase. They're too expensive, and they don't often actually serve people who are most in need. They serve people who can afford the services. So we need to think of mental health innovation as a form of social innovation. And a lot of the research shows that the best thing you can do to protect your mental health in disaster, care for it while it's happening, and recover afterwards is to increase your social connectedness and your social capital in the places where you live. So the ability of your community to come together and actually solve problems that it decides on for itself. And that sounds kind of basic, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make that a reality.
Wow. See, I'm quite excited by what you're saying, because one of the tenets and core beliefs that has animated the work that I've done is that the way to a sustainable food system is to reestablish the healthy relationships between human beings and humans in the environment. And that's basically what you're saying here, the reestablishment of relationship.
Yeah.
I jumped to what you said about an earlier time when we were more indigenous, and ritual was part of our existence almost on a daily basis. So, and still is in some religions, but do you see a role for massive ritual or community ritual? Because my brother's part of basically a group that practices a collective grief, allows themselves to collectively surface the grief and deal with the grief that's going on in the world in Sebastopol here. So I'm wondering, I mean, do you see that possibility as a scaling, or are you thinking of other pathways?
That's really interesting. I write about mourning rituals in the book, specifically the challenge of mourning the non-human world and how we do that when it's kind of the grief of ecological loss that is non-human is really disenfranchised. We don't have any social norms about how to mourn a glacier or a burnt forest or, a species that's gone extinct. And it feels funny and awkward. And at the same time, people are really grieving, especially those who live in connection with those landscapes that are being lost or those species. So
this reminds me of your first book.
That
whole final chapter.
Very much.
And the interview, the incredible conversation you had with, I guess he was an ethicist or a biological ethicist about the loss of species and the need to grieve, and that we shouldn't try to bring a species back. We should let it be gone, and we should grieve it because it might change us.
Yes, because grief and mourning is an opportunity to relearn the world and understand what's been lost and reorient for the future. Exactly. And through that first book, I learned of a group called Remembrance Day for Lost Species. I didn't write about it in the first book, but I wrote about it in the new one.
What's it called?
Remembrance Day for Lost Species.
Remembrance Day for Lost Species.
They have a day once a year in November. Yes, the Remembrance Day for Lost Species, where they mourn extinct species that humans have made, kick the can. And they do it through all kinds of experimental artistic rituals. They often create these huge effigies out of paper mache of the species and then bring them out on a canoe, for example, into the middle of the sea and then light it on fire. Or they run up a mountain with the effigy and, they do ritualistic things. And it's the woman, Persephone Pearl, who started it, described it to me as creating a time out of time, because there's nothing normative about it, and we don't know how to do this, but creating a space where people can come together and read or talk or grieve or lament what it means to be a human doing this to other species, it allows you to have these conversations that are so hard otherwise because of the disenfranchised nature of this grief. And it's in the book I tie it with what happened with the AIDS crisis, like in the Reagan era, when thousands of Americans were dying from AIDS, and it took him almost 5 years into his presidency to even say AIDS out loud and recognize the epidemic. And we say so much when we say nothing at all, right? We tell you don't matter, if we're not going to be mourning your death. And that was happening to so many people who were dying from AIDS.
Well,
and so
it reminds me of why Black Lives Matter says, say their name.
exactly.
Say their name.
Yes, exactly. It is a political act. Mourning is a political act, and it also is a meaningful act. And when you deny one's ability to mourn, you're saying they don't matter. And that's what's happening with a lot of non-human loss as well in the climate and ecological crisis. So I think there's an opportunity for, and I'm seeing more artists playing with this, and it's just starting to percolate that there's these weeping rituals in Finland that are happening for cut forests.
Beautiful.
For people to ritually connect and talk about what's being lost. And then that can become a political lever. And it says, we need to talk about this and we need to deal with this.
People.
And we mobilize. Exactly.
Wow, I'm getting the chills, to be honest. I'm seriously all over my shoulders.
Wow.
I'll tell you why. I think this is the root of why I loved your book and wanted to connect and have these conversations. You said earlier that the beginning with the Greek philosophers, we've moved in a certain direction, which is really intellectual and data and fact driven, which is important. But it seems to me there's a loss of balance. And what you're a scientist, and what I see you doing is making room for this other piece of the human experience that's kind of been left out since the Industrial Revolution. I don't know when.
Yeah.
It's gotten less and less and less to the point now where, well, it's ironic. We have a president who denies science, but we also have a scientific community that only looks at science or only technology and thinks that the solution to everything is technology and science. So what I'm hearing you say is, yes, science and technology are extremely important. That's what a lot of your work and things that you've covered in your different writing and podcasts and TV shows. Yet, now you're talking about this other piece. So that's so interesting to me.
Well, I'm glad you see that they can sit together in the same space, because they do, and they always have. It's just that we generally neglect one side of it when we're in scientific cultural spaces, right? It's emotions are seen with huge suspicion in scientific arenas. And in my book, I really call that out as a danger, because of course people think, oh, you're going to be working from emotion and interest and bias, and you're going to screw up the way you analyze your data, and it's not going to be objective. At the same time, there is this crazy taboo that says scientists cannot be real, full human beings that have emotions about what they're learning about the world at the same time as working from impartial evidence, which is just really messed up, And it means that we've had scientists playing the courteous acceptability card for decades on the climate crisis in fora of decision-making power, rather than marching in there like Greta Thunberg and saying, you are stealing our children's futures, and they're never going to forgive you.
You should be saying to these politicians.
Exactly.
I mean, really?
Yeah.
Incredible. And not just politicians, it's the CEOs that control the politicians.
Right. Definitely. It's quite the mangle there. But there are some scientists breaking the rules, being emotional about it. But then you talk to those who work with, politicians, and they're in Congress and they're presenting, and they say, and I quote them in my book very specifically, they are careful constantly to never come off as an advocate, because they know that they want the research to make a positive difference. So they need to sway politicians, and they'll do whatever they need to protect that legitimacy in their eyes. But they will be written off immediately if they show a flair or verve of passion in their voice.
Well, this is interesting, because I deal with it in my little world in Sacramento, dealing with politicians and bringing them data about diabetes. The data does not actually, in the end, does not sway them. It's the corporations that sway them.
Yeah.
Because they'll see the data and oh yeah, that's terrible, but they won't act because there's somebody with a lot of money who's stopping them from acting by giving them something. It's the same thing in the climate world, is it not?
So, I mean, historically, on many, yes, it has been through and through in many environments where decisions are being made. But there are also, renegade scientists that come out there and try to tell it like it is and rabble rouse. But they're often written off, like James Hansen
I was going to say James Hansen.
is obviously very powerful and has been there since the get-go and has seen
Right.
all of the perversion in terms of the denial that's been fabricated in the halls of power and spoken against it. But people who I've interviewed were former lead authors of the IPCC and say that they need to always ensure that they never sound like James Hansen, because they talk to political staffers who say, we just don't listen to what he says.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Or Paul Ehrlich would be another
Paul Ehrlich
example.
would be another one. So going back to what you were saying about your path forward, this idea of communities acting in some way to face together so that they can handle it psychologically, face together what's coming as a way to both organize and animate their actions. And you gave some examples. Do you think this is a wave that's going to increase across the world?
Examples of how to bring social innovation and mental health innovation together?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm seeing a lot of signs of powerful intellects explaining and exploring why this needs to be the way in university settings. And at the same time saying, I don't know anyone at the Royal College of Psychiatry in my country who's implementing this, or, I don't know that any of the big psychological associations are yet onto it. So there's a gulf between what's being advocated for and then what's happening. But I think that will be filled in. I mean, there are some really exciting people. There's a guy named Gary Belkin who started an institute in New York called the Billion Minds Institute. He's a really savvy psychiatrist who's really into this terrain of social innovation being mental health innovation. And he's starting to now make some of the first plugged in connections for big psych organizations and institutions in the United States to start working at a grassroots level with communities to help give them the supports they need so that they can start this journey of identifying the issues they want to tackle in their communities and then raising their social capital while they're at it for increased mental health care. I'm hopeful about that getting to demonstrate some really strong pilots and then be replicated in other places. There's a really wonderful Harvard psychiatrist named Vikram Patel who has demonstrated in Goa, India, where there are very, very, very few mental health professionals for how many people have many mental health problems, that you can actually train on the ground community members, lay people, to provide what's needed to help people through depression and anxiety and other forms of mental health problems. And they can do it more effectively than actual primary public health care facilitators. So there's lots, and there's like over 100 randomized trials now that show that this kind of task sharing with lay people for mental health care is more effective because you work with people who are in that community with folks, and they have a level of relating.
What do you mean task sharing?
So, sorry, yeah, that's jargon. Task sharing means sharing the task of providing mental health care. So usually it would come from a psychiatrist or a psychologist or some kind of counselor, but you can share the tasks of that work with people in the community who are volunteers, and then they actually get what's needed, which is very, manageable to be able to help people in their communities. I suppose in some cases they're not volunteers, they're paid, but it,
but they're not psychological workers or
no background.
health workers. No. They're community members.
They're community members, exactly.
They're in relationship to these folks.
They're in relationship, that's right. And they help them faster than quote unquote real mental health care and more effectively. And then it also brings that community together, right? It's another node for creating connectedness.
Wow.
And helping people solve their own problems where they are.
I love this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really exciting. So I'm hopeful that it'll be expanded for sure.
Yeah, so I want to go back to kind of where we started. We are narrowing down on the point here, the end of the show here, but I wanted to highlight the fact that you said the climate crisis, the loss of species crisis, the pandemic crises that will come in more waves.
Right.
The struggle of to create real equity and inclusion in this world, which is manifest right now, disturbed by racism. I mean, all of those crises are huge and compounding and cascading. So they're going to be on top of each other more and more, just like we're experiencing now.
Yeah.
And that can be overwhelming and daunting. I know that the young people in my life carry a lot of anxiety about their futures. Plus, they have debt, student debt. They can't get jobs. It's all screwed up, right? The economy. So that is daunting, and there's a darkness associated with it, and there's a lot of mental health problems emerging, and that moved you. But despite all of that, you believe that humans will innovate and adapt, and that we will work our way through these current challenges.
Michael, I can't tell you that we're going to work our way through in a way that helps protect all of us. I am not sure or hopeful of that, unfortunately. I really wish it were the case. It is, an absolute tragedy in terms of the inequality that's already at play that will be widened by what's happening. And, we're talking by the middle of this century, low estimation is 140 million climate migrants moving around. Higher estimations are over 1 billion. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are going to be put in danger and, not able to subsist in any kind of sense of normalcy as they have it now. So I think humans will make it through. I think there will be adaptations and innovations, and, we're likely to be going through some kind of bottleneck event. And a lot of
bottleneck event.
A skimming down of the population, possibly.
Mm-hmm. A die-off of human beings.
Possibly, right?
I think it's happening already in a certain way.
Yeah. I mean, we're projected to have population increase a lot by 2100, around 11 point something billion, but we're also projected to see a lot of calamity. So I don't know. I mean, it's all about sitting in the tense space of uncertainty and being able to hold open multiple possibilities ahead. But I'm certainly not preaching extinction, if that's what you mean. I think humans will be innovating. I think we are very scrappy. I think we have very deep resilience. And I think the challenge is that a lot of people who have not been faced with a kind of overarching threat until waking up to the climate and biodiversity crisis, because they've lived lives of relative privilege, are finding it very hard and very scary because they always thought that the world was a safe place for them.
Right.
And this is the first time they're realizing that rug has been ripped out from under them. It's not safe.
Right.
And, other people who have always known the world is not safe, let's say that they are generationally traumatized through slavery, colonization, other forms of oppression, they have a more flexible resilience.
Right.
Arguably better prepared.
With Black friends, I've been having that exact conversation.
Really?
Latinos, yeah. And I know certainly from my contacts and work with Indigenous people through the slow food movement, man, there's a ton of resilience in that community.
So much. And every human can cultivate that.
Right.
And so I think, the rise of eco-anxiety is kind of a reckoning for privileged people, largely, to buck up and get some resilience.
Right.
And realize that they have a huge capacity for it, actually.
Yes.
And there's lots of ways of exploring that. So it's a time for reparations. It's a time for healing and reconnection with nature, with other humans, with other species, and developing and cultivating this kind of deep existential resilience to be able to live without being traumatized by fear and realize all the beauty that exists alongside all of the pain.
That's a beautiful way to end the conversation, because I am with you. I believe that the crisis that you've studied so well and offered thoughtful ways to deal with it is a great opportunity for the human species to transform itself in a way that puts it in right relationship, as you so well described right there. So thank you, Britt,
Thank you.
Dr. Ray, for another fabulous conversation. Really enjoyed it. I think I hope, and I'm almost positive that it will enrich many people that listen to it. So thank you for your time again.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.